My name is Indira Rajaraman. I was born in Delhi and attended educational institutions in Delhi before going on to get a PhD from Cornell University in the US. I taught for 18 years at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore from 1976 to 1994. And then we moved back to Delhi, where I held the Reserve Bank of India chair at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy until my retirement at the age of 60. After retirement, immediately after retirement, I was a member of the 13th Finance Commission, which took 2 years. And after that, I served a 4-year term on the Central Board of the Reserve Bank of India. As I mentioned, starting in 1993, when the Constitution was amended to include a third tier of government, local bodies, we are a 3-tier federation, and rights to collect taxes are vested at each level of those 3 tiers. The central government collects taxes as specified in the Union List of Schedule 7. State governments collect taxes as specified in the State List of Schedule 7. And local governments collect taxes whose powers have been vested in them by their respective state governments. That is as far as the constitutional provision goes. But what typically are the taxes that we pay, and to which level of government do they accrue? When you pay an income tax, or when a corporate entity pays an income tax, that accrues to the center. When you pay duty on an import, that also accrues to the center. What do states collect? Earlier, they used to collect sales taxes on sales of goods within their jurisdictions. But after the Constitution was amended in 2015 to permit the center and states to jointly levy something called a Goods and Services Tax, the GST, for the first time, the tax domains of center and states were merged. So today, when you pay GST at, let's say, 18% on some purchase, 9% of that goes to the state where you have made the purchase, and 9% goes to the central government. However, that 9% which goes to the central government gets merged into the total tax revenues of the center, and 42% of that will still flow to the states, all states in aggregate. So it is not as though what states collect from the GST is confined to the state GST portion, which, as I said, is half of the total rate collected. They also get their share of the 42%, which is collected by the center. However, that 42% is distributed between states according to the formula of the Finance Commission. So they won't get that 42% back by jurisdiction. It's not as though they will get back 42% of what was collected in their state. They will get their share as determined by the sharing formula of the Finance Commission of 42% of the central collection. And let me add one more qualification. It was 42% when Jammu and Kashmir was a state. Now that Jammu and Kashmir is no longer a state, the share of states has been reduced to 41%, and we have to wait for the final report of the 15th Finance Commission to see where they will position that sharing percentage, because every Finance Commission has the right to change that sharing percentage. Municipalities and Gram Panchayats have a tax base, a tax lever, which is assigned to them in all states, and that is the property tax. The property tax that you pay on your residential house, the property tax paid by commercial entities, these accrue to municipalities and to panchayats. The problem, however, is that panchayats in particular don't have much of a property tax base at all. For instance, thatched roof structures cannot be taxed under the property tax. So panchayats, rather more than municipalities, are dependent on their respective states for a grant to tide them over. It was because of that that starting in the 1990s, finance commissions have prescribed a local grant. If you remember the gray sliver in those pie charts, which has grown to what is going to be 9% in the forthcoming budget year, that local grant was prescribed precisely in order to aid local governments, both urban and rural, since their tax base is limited. In the case of some municipalities like in Mumbai, the property tax base is quite large, but it is very small in smaller cities and of course essentially non-existent in rural areas. So you have therefore a local grant which does not go directly to local governments because under the constitution the center cannot send any funds directly to local governments. So it goes through the states. It is sent to the states for onward transmission to local bodies. The allocation of funding from state governments to local governments is not in accordance with what people would like. And one particular service which is very underfunded all over the country today is police protection. You will have noticed that in many cities in India, there are gated communities where essentially private guards have been appointed in order to perform the function of policing, which is really a city function. It is the police which are supposed to keep the people safe. They should not have to hire private guards to protect apartment blocks, but they do. And of course, the streets are under-policed. In part, it's because even the limited police resources that exist are lopsidedly distributed towards the protection of politicians and other people deemed very important, and therefore they're not available for the protection of ordinary people. But to answer your question about the funding of these, yes, police, except in Delhi, which has a particular status whereby police is paid for directly by the central government, in all other states, police is paid for locally, heavily financed by the state government, but not sufficiently. I'm glad you asked that question because this is a very current live issue bearing on the federal structure of the country. Going back to those pie charts, if you remember, the blue portion, which was the dominant portion, is the tax share, and it's unconditional. And I mentioned that it was a very important reason why the federation has hung together. Having an unconditional tax share has been a very important thing for states because they claim, and the public finance literature also supports them, that they should not be directed from above as to what they should do with the funding which comes to them. The idea is that they will choose their expenditure patterns, and that if the population is not happy with what they have chosen, the population will vote them out. So they consider themselves to be downwardly accountable to the electorate and resent having any expenditure directions given to them from above. However, as you noticed, the tax share, although still above 80%, has been ceding space to grants. And why has it been doing that? It has been doing that because grants can be conditional. They can be sectoral. And as you saw from the list of sectors that the 15th Finance Commission has said they are going to pay attention to when they come out with their final report in October of 2020, you can see a large number of sectors were listed, starting with nutrition, but including police training and housing, and a whole host of other sectors which they feel the states have not paid enough attention to. So your question is a very, very important one. It bears on the distribution of the statutory grant between an unconditional tax share and conditional grants. And those who see the common population of this country, you and I, not getting enough from the state, broadly defined, for the particular services that we need, that indeed is why the share of that grant sliver has grown and may grow even more. During the colonial era, you will remember that the colonial administration was handled by a very, very small sliver of officials at the top. And they were all urban residents for the most part, except for the odd district collector, one in each district. So because they were urban residents, a lot of attention was given to urban services. Post 1947, we became an electoral democracy. More than 80% of the population was resident in rural areas. There was a need to attend to the neglected rural sector of the country, which had suffered for a century or more under British rule, owing to very severe taxation of agriculture. So as a result, the attention of the democratically elected government, whether at the center or states, shifted from the urban sector to the rural sector. That's one point. The other is that the kind of goods and services that people are looking for, what are called public goods by economists, that is to say non-excludable, non-rival. What we mean by that is clean air, let's say. If we have clean air, we all benefit. If we have dirty air, as you know, we all suffer. And although rich people can buy themselves some reprieve from dirty air by buying air purifiers, this option is not available to most of the population. So pollution is something that affects everybody, and cleaning up pollution is one of the public goods that we expect government to work actively towards. But what has happened with the structure of our democracy and the structuring of our elections is that political competition between political parties has led to an increasing wooing of the electorate by providing goods which are excludable and rival. So, for instance, political parties will compete against one another by providing, let's say, gadgets of various kinds, or liquor, or a big dinner, or something which is a very excludable, rivalrous kind of good, and does not fall in the classical set of public goods which governments are supposed to provide. This is what political competition has done to the nature of government spending, the increasing focus on transfers to benefit particular segments of the population. So we need to sort this out. Increasingly, I think elections in India are rewarding governments for paying attention to public problems, public issues, and hopefully we will be moving towards more provision of public goods and less of the kind of individual transfers that we have seen in recent decades. From a fiscal perspective, we do suffer from a particular limitation, which is that the overall tax to GDP ratio aggregating across the center and states is currently running at around 17.5% of GDP. Out of that 17.5%, 11% is tax revenue collected by the central government, and 6.5% is collected by states, adds up to 17.5. This is one of the lowest tax GDP ratios in the world. Even our neighboring countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are more successful at collecting tax revenues. It's well known that there is widespread evasion in India, evasion of not merely income tax, but also what are called indirect taxes, like the GST, for instance, is an indirect tax. And it has been a huge struggle for governments to enforce payment of taxes. So you might well ask, why does India have this particular problem? Why don't those other countries have the same problem? The reason is that we still have not solved a very key problem in any democracy, which is funding of political parties. So what happens is that a potential taxpayer is a person who has the option of contributing to the funding of a political party, and to that extent gets some reprieve from having to pay taxes into the formal exchequer. So political party funding has become a competitor to the exchequer. And that is why we have had such a problem with tax evasion in this country. But as recent elections have shown, and we need to take courage and strength from that and encouragement, we know, for instance, that in the recent election in Delhi, many of the candidates of the winning party found their funds through crowd-sourced platforms. That is, they advertised on their website for an invited funding from ordinary people. And adding up the small bits and pieces, they were able to get enough to run their political campaigns. So this is the future, as I see it. Technology has enabled these crowd funding platforms, and hopefully in future, there will be less of competition between political party funding and funds going into the exchequer. We will see a rise in the tax GDP ratio, and we will correspondingly see an improvement in the services that you and I look for. There has been an estimate done by the International Monetary Fund, which was recently aired by them. It was a little too severe, I thought, in terms of estimating evasion. But I think going from 17.5, which is where we are at the moment, to 22% should be relatively easy. And that will be a phenomenal change in the funds that will be available at the center and the states. So 22% is, I think, where we need to be. 25% is perhaps achievable, but I don't think we should shoot for more than that. Well, the states which have controlled their population are very angry about this move away from the 1971 census to the most recent census, which in the case of the 15th Finance Commission will continue to be the 2011 census, since the 2021 census has still not happened. They are annoyed about it. They feel that it carries a perverse punishment for states which have controlled their population. But the issues which arise in the case of statutory flows from the center and delimitation are really quite separate and distinct. In the case of transfers from the center, what are these transfers for, after all? They are meant to provide comparable services in terms of public goods, non-excludable and non-rival, cleaner water, cleaner air, law and order. These things are supposed to be broadly uniform across a country which varies widely in prosperity levels. Unless you take account of the present population, even in states which have not tried very hard to control their population, you are not being fair at all. After all, the population, the new population which came into existence because of the failure to control population, they are there. Nobody asked them if they wanted to live. They have come into being. We have to recognize the fact that they exist. And we have to provide for them just as we provide for the more controlled population in other states which have paid attention to population control. And furthermore, states which paid attention to population control reaped the benefits of their attention over a 35-year span. They were getting an allocation in proportion to their share in population in 1971, which was much higher than what it was or is today. So they have reaped their reward. And it is now time for them to recognize that people who have come into existence, they were born for no fault of their own in states which did not pay attention to population. They nevertheless have a right to exist, and they have a right to be taken into account when transfers are calibrated according to the Finance Commission formula. That is a very different issue from the delimitation exercise, which is going to give less political power at the center to states which have controlled their population. I don't have a ready to answer to that. That is unfortunate, and perhaps a political commission should be formed to take care of the problems that could arise if some states which have been very dutiful in controlling their population find themselves punished in terms of becoming politically less powerful in a new forthcoming political configuration. The southern states which have been leading the pack of states in terms of population control, they have also been magnets for migration. Yes. And in fact, much of the routine work in these states, including agricultural operations, harvesting, could not possibly be completed without in-migration from the northern states. Now, in the population census, there is a distinction made easily available from the figures in terms of the natural growth of population and also the growth on account of migration. But even if you add on migrants, these states have not grown very much in population. The simple reason being that the migration that does happen is seasonal. Population flows in from the northern states just for the harvesting operation, and then it goes right back. Most of these migrants do not become permanent residents. If they do become permanent residents, then yes, they do get counted in the permanent population of the state from census to census. But since much of the migration is seasonal, they don't get counted. And so yes, these are all important issues that need to be taken on board when looking at issues like delimitation. I'm happy you asked that question because, as a matter of fact, if you look at constitutional amendments over the years, the movement of functions and subjects has been from the state list to the concurrent list, which is to say that the state list has been whittled down to some degree, and these functions have moved to the concurrent list. So why did that happen? A lot of that movement took place during the emergency in the mid-1970s and was political in nature. But a lot of the movement was really not political. It happened because there was a sense of dissatisfaction in the country as a whole and at the center that functions which had been assigned to states were not being adequately addressed by the states, such as, for instance, nutrition, such as, for instance, maternal and child mortality, infant mortality. We had huge disparities between states in infant mortality. We had some states which had infant mortality at levels prevailing in Europe. We had other states whose infant mortality levels were at those prevailing in sub-Saharan Africa, worse sometimes. We could not tolerate these huge divergences within what is, after all, one country. We have to give an infant born the same chance whether that infant is born in a poorly performing state or in a well-performing state. It was for that reason that some of these functions, though not all these functions, were moved from the state to the concurrent list. And the reason that was done was in order to enable the center to pass laws in Parliament requiring certain minimal levels of achievement in the states, which they could not have done if they had been passing laws on a subject which was in a state list. So that is why many subjects were transferred to the concurrent list.